Somewhere between darkness and truth, there are people who vanished without a single goodbye. Welcome to the place where unsolved mysteries breathe again, where we reopen the cases time tried to bury. Night at sea has a way of holding secrets. On March 22, 2012, as the cruise ship Ocean Whisper drifted through unnervingly calm waters on its journey from Los Angeles toward Mexico, something happened that no one on board could explain. At 5:45 a.m., when most passengers were still sleeping and the decks were nearly silent, a young crew member named Elena Carter walked into a small restricted cabin deep within the staff corridors. She picked up an internal phone and spoke for just over a minute. Her voice, usually bright and steady, trembled on the edge of panic. Only one fragment of her whisper was ever clearly understood. "Please, don't do this." Seconds later, she hung up, stepped out of that room, and disappeared into the dim hallway. From that moment forward, Elena was never seen again. No alarms, no witnesses, no signs of struggle. A ship carrying thousands of people continued its routine as if nothing had happened, yet somewhere within its steel walls, a young woman had simply slipped out of existence. What followed was confusion, contradictory statements, missing footage, and explanations that seemed to close more doors than they opened. And as her family searched for answers, it became clear that the truth behind Elena's disappearance wasn't lost to the ocean. It was buried much closer to the ship itself. Tonight, we reopen the mystery the world quietly moved on from. What really happened to Elena Carter aboard the Ocean Whisper? The night before Elena Carter vanished, the Ocean Whisper moved through the Pacific with a steady hum, the kind of motion that lulls most people into a dreamless sleep. But Elena wasn't sleeping. She hadn't been, not properly, for weeks. Those who worked closest to her remembered the shift, not sudden, but slow and unsettling. A girl who once glowed with the joy of working at sea had begun drifting through her days like someone carrying a weight she couldn't put down. She stayed longer on the upper decks after her shift, sitting alone as the wind pushed her hair across her face. She stared out at the water as if waiting for something to surface. When co-workers asked if she was all right, she smiled too quickly, said she was tired, said everything was fine, but her eyes told a different story. On the night of March 21st, Elena finished her shift at 11 p.m. She walked through the crew corridor with a hooded sweatshirt pulled tight, a cup of coffee clasped in her hands, though she rarely drank coffee this late. The cameras caught her moving with purpose, but also with the hesitation of someone trying to avoid being seen. A few co-workers remembered crossing paths with her. They said she looked pale, distracted, as if her mind was someplace far from the brightly lit halls of the ship. Just after midnight, she was seen on the crew deck, the one only accessible with an employee card. She stayed there longer than usual, leaning on the railing, her face hidden by the brim of a cap that wasn't hers. Later, investigators would confirm the hat belonged to a male staff member, someone Elena had recently grown distant from, though no one could explain why. When she finally returned to her cabin, she didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the edge of her bed, motionless, her hands pressed against her face. Somewhere around 3 a.m., a neighbor heard a sound, not loud, not alarming, just a quiet sob, quickly stifled. By 4:20 a.m., Elena left her room again. This time, she walked slower. Her shoulders were tense, her breathing shallow. She moved through areas of the ship where she rarely went, down past the Children's Activity Center, past the staff cafeteria, deeper into halls reserved mostly for engineering crews. These back corridors felt different at night, colder, stripped of the glamour passengers knew. They were narrow, metallic, echoing with the distant clatter of machinery. Here, footsteps carried. Here, voices whispered differently. And somewhere in those halls, Elena paused. It was the kind of pause that feels like a person arguing with themselves. Go forward or turn back? But she chose forward. She walked toward the cabin where, at 5:45 a.m., she would pick up the phone and speak the last words anyone ever heard from her. A phone call that should never have existed. A call to someone who never came forward. A call that marked the final minute before she disappeared into the quiet heartbeat of the ship. Her last night on the Ocean Whisper was not a night of fear. It was a night of decisions, and one of them took her beyond the reach of everyone who cared about her. Morning broke slowly over the Pacific, the kind of muted sunrise that slips across the water without announcing itself. By 9 a.m., most passengers on the Ocean Whisper were waking to the promise of another day at sea. Breakfast buffets, pool decks warming under the sun, the soft rhythm of vacation. But somewhere below, on Deck B, someone finally noticed that Elena Carter hadn't shown up for her shift. At first, it didn't spark panic. Crew members overslept. Schedules changed. Mistakes happened. Yet when repeated calls to Elena's cabin went unanswered, when the supervisor keyed into her room and found the bed untouched, something shifted in the air. A message crackled through staff radios. Crew member missing. Begin internal search procedure. It sounded official, controlled, almost reassuring. But what unfolded over the next few hours was anything but. The ship was vast. 11 decks above water, 5 below, hundreds of rooms, miles of corridors. A search like this required urgency, coordination, precision. Instead, it felt rushed, chaotic, almost performative. Crew teams swept through public areas first, even though logic dictated they should check restricted zones, mechanical rooms, and staff-only decks where Elena was last seen. They didn't, or weren't allowed to. Some areas were never searched at all by the time the Ocean Whisper finally contacted the U.S. Coast Guard. Precious hours had been lost, hours that, at sea, mean everything. And yet, despite the growing realization that something was deeply wrong, the ship did not stop. It did not turn around. It did not retrace its route back to the coordinates where Elena might have gone overboard. Instead, it kept moving forward, following its itinerary like a machine that couldn't afford to care. Passengers lounged by the pool unaware. The casino opened on schedule. Children splashed in the shallow end while 3 decks below, officers debated what to report and what to withhold. When the Coast Guard finally launched their search pattern, the distance the ship had already traveled left them covering an impossibly wide stretch of empty ocean. Nothing. No clothing, no debris, no body. Just miles of flat, indifferent water. Inside the ship's command room, the captain reviewed Elena's last known movements, the footage, the logs, the timestamps, and made a decision that still haunts her family today. Proceed to next port, he ordered. Even as the search outside continued, even as crew whispered in hallways, even as the truth began slipping through the ship's fingers, the Ocean Whisper sailed forward, and somewhere behind it, in the widening distance of that morning sea, whatever happened to Elena was being swallowed by the waves. not because the ocean hid it, but because the ship never truly tried to find her. By the time Elena was officially declared missing, the Ocean Whisper had already docked at its next port, and the ship's security office was preparing a report they knew would be scrutinized. Every word had to be clean, every timestamp unquestionable, every gap explainable. Or at least, that was the idea. Because once investigators began examining the ship's surveillance system, something became immediately clear. The timeline didn't make sense. The Ocean Whisper boasted more than 800 cameras, each feeding into a central server room deep inside Deck E, a place accessible only to senior security officers. The footage was supposed to create a seamless record of every corridor, every stairwell, every door Elena might have passed through. But it didn't. Entire segments were missing, as if the ship itself were blinking in and out of awareness. A hallway camera that should have captured her movement between cabins froze for 9 minutes. A stairwell feed skipped from 2:17 a.m. to 2:32 a.m. A deckside camera, the one closest to her reported last location, recorded nothing but darkness, even though the lights were functioning that night. Technical failure, the ship claimed. Coincidence, they suggested. But then investigators discovered something that was harder to dismiss. In the digital archive, where Elena's final hours should have been stored, several file directories showed signs of manual access. Not system errors, not corrupted data. Manual. Someone had gone into the server between 4 and 5 a.m., the narrow window after Elena disappeared but before the search had even begun, and altered the logs. Who that person was, the ship could not answer, or would not. Then there was her key card. Every crew member's key card functioned like a digital fingerprint. Doors opened, shifts logged, movements tracked. Elena's should have shown a clear record of where she had been. It didn't. From 1:48 a.m. onward, her keycard registered no activity at all, as if she had simply stopped existing within the ship's system. But investigators found something even more unsettling. A door to a restricted maintenance corridor, one that required elevated clearance, had been unlocked just minutes after Elena was last seen. Not forced. Unlocked. Someone with access had been there. Someone who shouldn't have been. And then came the passenger statement, the one buried in the back of the report, nearly overlooked. A woman in cabin 64102 claimed she heard a sharp metallic sound around 2 a.m. Not a scream, not a cry. Something heavier, something deliberate. She said it came from below her floor, the same level where the maintenance corridor was. As investigators pieced these fragments together, a picture was forming, not of an accident, but of a disappearance shaped by hands that understood the ship far too well, a disappearance that felt prepared, calculated, and as one officer summarized in his private notes, found later through a leaked email, if this was an accident, the evidence wouldn't look so afraid of being discovered. Marjorie Hale didn't think of herself as a witness. She wasn't even sure she had heard anything meaningful. But when investigators asked her to sit for a second interview, she arrived with a folded napkin in her hands, the kind passengers use in the ship's dining hall, twisting it tighter each time they repeated the same question. What exactly did you hear at 2 a.m.? At first, she said the same thing, a metallic sound, a single impact. Nothing more. But investigators noticed something. Every time she mentioned the sound, her eyes shifted, not away in fear, but inward, as if she were replaying a frame she wasn't certain she wanted to describe. So they asked again. This time, She exhaled, slowly, and she admitted that after the metallic thud, she heard another noise, faint but unmistakable, the quiet brush of fabric moving against metal, not footsteps, not voices, just a brief whisper of someone shifting their weight beside a door. A detail easy to dismiss, but not when the location she described corresponded to a maintenance hallway known to be off-limits to passengers. Still, Marjorie insisted she hadn't seen anyone. She insisted she didn't know more. And yet, when investigators walked her through the ship's floor plan, her finger hovered, barely touching the map, over a narrow corridor that connected to the staff access route. It wasn't a guess. Her hand moved too quickly for that. Something in her memory wanted to surface, but something else held it back. The investigators noted her hesitation, but they didn't push her. Not yet. Because at the same time Marjorie was being interviewed, another team was combing through the lower decks, the ones the public rarely saw. They weren't looking for people. They were looking for interruptions, things that didn't belong, disturbances that usually go unnoticed on a ship of this size, and that's when they found it. Inside a narrow junction where two maintenance panels met, a small object had become lodged in the rubber lining. Not obvious, not bright, just a sliver of material barely visible unless you were searching for it. A thread, black, but not quite. More like dark navy, synthetic, tightly woven, durable, the kind used in uniforms. But the ship had many uniforms: maintenance, engineering, housekeeping, security, and none of them used this exact shade. The lead investigator bagged it, labeled it, and stared at it for a long moment. The thread wasn't proof. It wasn't even a hint. It was merely the suggestion of a story, one that hadn't decided whether it wanted to be heard. When they reviewed staff access logs for the corridor where the thread was found, one entry stood out. Not because it was suspicious, but because it was ordinary in a way that felt deliberate. A keycard swipe at 2:11 a.m. No error, no anomaly. Just a clean, perfect log by someone on duty. Someone who had no reason to be there. But also, no reason not to be. His name wasn't flagged. He wasn't questioned. Not yet. Because investigators knew something important. A disappearance like Elena's isn't solved by the first clue. It's solved by the clue that makes all the others uncomfortable. And whatever truth was buried in that thread, in Marjorie's half-spoken recollection, in the silent corridor at 2 a.m., that truth wasn't ready to come up to the surface, not yet. 3 days into the investigation, when the team believed they had already spoken to every relevant crew member, a young technician from the audio department stepped forward, not because he wanted to, but because he had been thinking too much to sleep, as he quietly admitted. His name was Luis Moreno, 26, soft-spoken, the kind of man who avoided eye contact unless necessary. He said he wasn't sure what he had mattered, but he kept replaying a moment from the night Elena disappeared, a moment he had tried to forget. Luis explained that around 1:40 a.m., he'd been doing a routine sweep of the ship's entertainment system. It required him to walk through a staff-only corridor behind the theater, a dim hallway with exposed pipes and low ceilings. He described how the area was usually silent at that hour, heavy with the hum of machinery, but that night it wasn't silent. He heard a voice, a woman's voice, not a scream, not a cry, something worse, a tone stretched thin with fear but held tight, as if she was trying not to be heard. He didn't catch the words, but he caught the rhythm of them, hurried, breathless, pleading. When asked why he didn't report it earlier, Luis lowered his eyes. "Because I wasn't supposed to be in that corridor at that hour, and because I didn't want to believe what I heard." Investigators marked the location on the ship map. It was disturbingly close to the maintenance junction where they'd found the dark thread. But before they could explore that link, something else occurred. Something that forced the investigation onto an entirely new track. One of the forensic teams re-examining crew cabins discovered that a section of the metal railing on Deck 6, a deck not previously considered relevant, had a faint but undeniable dent. Barely visible from afar, noticeable only when light hit it at the right angle, the metal was bent inward, not outward, as if something or someone had hit it from the inside. Salt residue around the dent differed from surrounding areas. It wasn't from ocean spray, it was from skin, as if a hand had gripped the railing tightly before something happened. The dent had been wiped poorly. Micro scratches suggested tools not used by the cleaning crew. The discovery created a fracture in the clean timeline the cruise company had insisted on. Because Deck 6 wasn't part of Elena's route that night. It wasn't where she had been last seen. It wasn't even on the list of decks she had access to that morning. So how did damaged metal, wiped by an unknown hand, appear there within hours of her disappearance? When asked to produce maintenance logs for that area, the ship's staff hesitated. Not for long, barely half a second, but investigators noticed. And the logs were incomplete. Missing timestamps, 2 entries overwritten, 1 name spliced, half typed, half erased. R. Calderon, a crew member from the engineering team. Not high level, not low level, just invisible enough to be overlooked. Calderon claimed he hadn't been on Deck 6 that night. He claimed his key card had a fault leading to blank swipes. He claimed he didn't know Elena. Every answer was reasonable, every detail lined up almost, because there was one small crack in his story. A single corridor camera that caught the back of a man walking toward Deck 6 at 2:03 a.m., carrying a tool pouch. The man's build matched Calderon. The posture matched him. The timing matched the dent. But the camera quality was too poor for identification. Calderon insisted it wasn't him, and investigators couldn't prove it was. Not yet. So for now, the dented railing became a question mark. Luis Moreno became an uneasy witness. And Calderon, he became something the investigation hadn't had until this point. A shadow worth watching. Investigators returned to Deck 6 before sunrise. The ocean was calm, the horizon washed in dull silver, but the team's focus stayed locked on the dented railing, the quiet, stubborn interruption in a place Elena should never have been. They photographed it again, measured it again, even tested the metal's flexibility, but what unsettled them wasn't the dent itself. It was the absence surrounding it. No fingerprints, no shoe prints, no fibers, nothing except the faint smear of a wiped surface. A wipe done by someone who knew exactly what parts of the railing would matter. As they worked, another officer radioed in from the security office. He had been cross-checking camera logs, not for footage, since cameras in that area were outdated, but for power fluctuations, something often overlooked. Old cameras don't fail silently. They flicker, draw unstable current, leave tiny scars in the electrical records. At 2:07 a.m., one such camera, the one facing the interior staircase leading to Deck 6, drew a sudden spike of power before going dark for 14 seconds. 14 seconds. just enough time for someone to walk past. But there was another problem. Maintenance reports claimed the camera had been offline for 28 hours due to wiring issues. A repair request filed by the engineering department, signed by R. Calderon. When pressed, Calderon insisted the timestamp must be wrong. Maybe the system had overwritten old data. Maybe a technician logged it late. Maybe the wiring had failed again. All plausible, none provable. But investigators had begun to notice something else, something subtle. In every interview, Calderon spoke, carefully, precisely, the way someone does when they're trying to hold a line steady. But when asked whether he had seen Elena in the days before she disappeared, he hesitated for the first time. Only a second, then said, "No, I barely knew who she was." A harmless answer, except Luis Moreno, the audio technician, mentioned something in passing during his follow-up interview. He remembered seeing Calderon in the staff cafeteria 2 weeks before Elena vanished, standing in line, talking to a woman who fit her description. He didn't hear the conversation, didn't think anything of it. But he remembered the laugh. He remembered Elena handing something small, maybe a key card, maybe a note, across the counter. Calderon denied it, said Luis was mistaken, said he must have seen someone else. Again, possible, again, unprovable. Investigators marked it down as a point of tension, nothing more, a thread not yet connected to anything. But the investigation took another turn when a storage closet adjacent to the Deck 6 stairwell was opened for the first time since the ship docked. Inside, under a stack of unused linens and cleaning supplies, was an object that did not belong there, a broken lanyard, navy blue, frayed at one end, no ID card attached, but the stitching, the exact dark navy synthetic weave, matched the thread found earlier near the maintenance junction on Deck 4. 2 decks apart, 2 different locations, 2 signs of something torn with force, not an accident, not wear and tear, a moment, a struggle. But whose lanyard was it? Crew uniforms all looked alike. Thousands of identical accessories circulated on the ship. Still, investigators noticed the clasp was newer than most, replaced recently. When they checked supply logs for issued replacements, they found only 3 crew members who had requested new lanyards in the past month. One name stood out, R. Calderon. It wasn't proof. It wasn't even enough to accuse him. It was simply another shape in the fog, a pattern forming where no pattern should exist. And yet, every time the investigators stepped toward it, the truth slipped away, replaced by possibilities so tangled that nothing, absolutely nothing, fit cleanly. Not yet. For a moment, it seemed like the investigation was finally tightening. The broken lanyard, the dented railing, the camera spike, the subtle fractures in Calderon's story. None of it was decisive, but together they formed a shape investigators could almost trace with their fingertips. Almost. Because on the morning they planned to search the engineering bay, the one place Calderon spent most of his shifts, something unexpected happened. A group of men in matching Navy suits boarded the Ocean Whisper, using the private gangway normally reserved for top-tier passengers. They did not wear badges, but their arrival silenced the crew faster than any uniformed officer could. Upper management, corporate, the kind of presence that made captains stand straighter. Within an hour, the atmosphere of the investigation changed. Subtly at first, then unmistakably. Rooms that had previously been open for forensic examination were suddenly under maintenance. Some logs investigators requested were now irretrievable due to system migration. Interviews were postponed because crew members had been reassigned to essential duties. The ship felt different, guarded, watched. One of the lead investigators, Anna Leary, requested updated security logs. But when the files arrived, they were strangely clean, too clean. Gaps that were previously filled now showed no activity. Timestamp irregularities vanished. Data never corrects itself. Someone had rewritten the ship. And that afternoon, the captain called for a meeting. He was polite, measured, careful with his words, the way people are when they're no longer speaking freely. He insisted that the company was fully cooperating. He also insisted that the ship needed to depart for its next scheduled voyage within 48 hours, per contractual obligations. A thinly veiled warning, investigators pushed back, politely but firmly. They requested more time, but time, suddenly, had become scarce. That was when an officer from the ship's internal security, Thomas Haviland, approached them privately. His voice was low, uneasy. "There was one more camera," he said, "a backup feed, not part of the main system." He hesitated, glancing over his shoulder. "It caught something at 2:11 a.m. I'm not supposed to tell you this." He passed a small thumb drive into Anna's hand, then walked away without another word. The video lasted 12 seconds. Not enough to show faces, not enough to show actions, but enough to destroy the clean corporate narrative. A figure, likely male, moving quickly down the restricted maintenance stairwell, a blur of dark fabric, something clutched in his hand, and behind him, a second figure lower to the ground, slumped or stumbling. The footage wasn't clear, couldn't be used as evidence, couldn't even confirm identities. But it was enough to know one thing. Elena didn't disappear by accident, and someone, somewhere, had known the camera existed and missed this one. Anna requested a forensic enhancement. 20 minutes later, corporate officers entered the investigation room with calm smiles and a message. All further digital analysis must be submitted through official channels, internal review protocol. The thumb drive was taken, locked in a corporate case, signed over to legal custody. That was the moment investigators felt the walls close. Later that evening, Calderon was interviewed again. His answers were the same, controlled, consistent, almost rehearsed. But now, investigators didn't know if he was protecting himself or if someone else was protecting him. By nightfall, the direction of the investigation had shifted. Not forward, not backward. Sideways. A slow, deliberate drift toward ambiguity, the kind that leaves no space for conclusions. The official report drafted that week would later summarize the entire case in a single, bloodless line. Insufficient evidence to determine criminal involvement. A conclusion reached too quickly, signed too neatly, and sealed before anyone could protest. But inside that fading horizon of what could no longer be pursued, one truth remained. The ship remembered. But it had been told not to speak. The final report was submitted on a dim, heavy afternoon, the kind where the sun sinks behind the horizon as if it, too, wanted to disappear. Far off in the distance, the low hum of ship horns drifted across the water, an echo of the truth no one dared to speak aloud. The investigation had stretched on for weeks, peeling back layers of suspicion only for each to be smothered again by unseen hands. The investigative team stepped out of the briefing room with faces carved in silence, not because they had found the truth, but because they knew the truth had been locked away somewhere beyond their reach. Witnesses who once spoke freely had grown suddenly cautious. Surveillance clips they had already secured were deemed unusable. Key statements were returned with requests for revision, phrased more gently, more vaguely, more harmlessly. They understood, but they could not say, and they could not prove. At the official press conference, the spokesperson read the conclusion with practiced calm. No definitive evidence of criminal activity was found. Elena's case is classified as a disappearance of undetermined cause. A safe statement, smooth, painless, causing no waves for anyone except her family and those who desperately wanted to know what really happened. In the back row, the lead investigator stood rigid, hands clenched. He remembered every detail that had been dismissed, every door closed before he could knock, every question he was told not to ask. He knew Elena hadn't simply vanished, and he knew someone, higher up somewhere in the shadows, wanted the case to fade quietly into the dark. That night, as the ship departed the harbor once more, the deck lights shimmered across the water like scattered fragments of a story left unfinished. Some passengers later claimed that if you stood by the rail when the wind picked up, you could hear something faint, like hurried footsteps, like the quickened breath of someone running out of time. No one could confirm it. No one dared deny it. The disappearance of Elena Castillo closed like a door locked from the inside. No one saw what happened, yet everyone sensed something had. And somewhere beneath the vast, shifting darkness of the ocean, the truth still drifts, waiting for the day it's dragged back into the light, if it isn't swallowed forever. Once the Ocean Whisper disappeared into the horizon, the investigation moved to land. Los Angeles, a city of lights and noise, felt different now, smaller, quieter, almost claustrophobic to the Carters. Mark and Helen arrived with one goal: to uncover what the authorities aboard the ship refused or failed to find. Lawyers, private investigators, and retired officers soon surrounded them. Every conversation hinted at obstruction. Every file handed over seemed incomplete. Pages were missing. Entries were blacked out. What little clarity the ship had offered dissolved like mist. Yet fragments persisted. Luis Moreno's testimony, Marjorie Hale's recollections, the dented railing, the broken lanyard, all became puzzle pieces on the floor of a sterile conference room. Investigators tried to assemble them, and slowly an unsettling pattern emerged. Someone was controlling the story from above, shaping it, filtering it, guiding what the public could see and what the family could learn. At the same time, former crew members began stepping forward, not many, not loudly, but quietly, in whispers. A young waitress mentioned seeing Elena speaking to a man in uniform days before her disappearance. She couldn't name him. She barely remembered what he looked like, but she remembered his presence, the way he seemed to follow her gaze, like he was measuring her reactions. Calderon's name surfaced again, not because anyone accused him, but because his movements appeared repeatedly in fragments. Hallway access logs, maintenance slips, minor discrepancies in timestamps. Nothing definitive, just hints, shadows lining the edges of a truth investigators could almost grasp. Then came the physical evidence that shook the preliminary narrative. A small backpack, partially hidden behind a stack of life vests in a lower-deck storage room, discovered by a forensic team rechecking every overlooked corner. Inside were a few personal items: Elena's notebook, a pen engraved with her initials, and a torn section of the same navy fabric found near the maintenance corridor, and the dented railing. Each item alone told almost nothing. Together, they hinted at a struggle, a path, a presence someone didn't want documented. Investigators pored over it, but the shadow of corporate oversight loomed larger than ever. Requests to trace fingerprints or DNA on the items were delayed, redirected, postponed. Every time they inched closer to clarity, someone in the higher ranks of the cruise company made sure the path curved away. And yet the Carters pressed on. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency mattered. Every shadow in the logs, every fragment of fabric, every hesitant witness became a beacon in a case that refused to reveal its full truth. Through it all, the message was clear. The investigation was allowed only to exist, never to conclude. And the person or people responsible for Elena's disappearance remained just beyond reach, a ghost walking between layers of truth and deception. Weeks of tireless investigation had led to this moment. Every minor inconsistency, every shadowy figure, every fragment of fabric, every dented railing suddenly threaded together into a tense, almost unbearable pattern. Investigators were closer than ever before, to understanding what had really happened to Elena. The forensic team meticulously examined the torn navy fabric found in Elena's backpack and the maintenance corridor. Blood traces, fibers, and faint residues suggested a struggle. Every detail screamed intent, yet every answer remained just out of reach. Calderon's movements, the suspicious timing of keycard swipes, the inconsistencies in his statements, all of it converged toward him. For once, the investigation had focus. The pieces aligned, creating the pulse of a story, begging to be told. A meeting room filled with analysts and detectives felt electric. Maps were spread across tables, files stacked high. Witnesses' statements were cross-checked and aligned, revealing subtle patterns in crew movements that hadn't been noticed before. Luis Moreno's recollection of the hushed voice, Marjorie Hale's fleeting observation, the dented railing, the navy thread. They were no longer random fragments. They were threads of a tapestry that, if pieced together fully, would expose what had happened in the dark hours of that night. The tension was unbearable. Every investigator leaned forward, every hand clenched, every mind racing. It was the moment before revelation, the edge of discovery, and then everything stopped. The Carters had met with representatives of the cruise company. A confidential settlement was reached. Elena was now officially recorded as a passenger who voluntarily left the ship. All legal action was dropped. All inquiries ceased. Phones rang in vain. Requests for further forensic analysis were denied. Cameras were locked. Witnesses were instructed to speak no further. The investigation was abruptly frozen. The room, once alive with energy and suspense, fell silent. Investigators stared at one another, numb. The files, the maps, the painstaking work, it all felt suddenly meaningless. One young detective finally muttered, "So, everything we uncovered, nothing matters?" The silence was absolute. The truth they had chased, the threads they had painstakingly pulled, the shadows they had illuminated, all suspended in a void they could not touch. The ocean outside remained calm, indifferent, reflecting the cruel reality. Sometimes the story ends not because the truth is revealed, but because someone far from the waves decides it must. And in that silence, the weight of what had been lost pressed down on everyone present. The peak of hope, the rush of discovery, the tension of imminent revelation, all vanished in a heartbeat, leaving only emptiness, unanswered questions, and shadows that stretched further than ever. Year after year, Mark and Helen Carter sent letters, pleas for answers, for any fragment of truth about their daughter. Every letter was met with silence, no explanation, no acknowledgement. Just the vast, unbroken quiet of an institution determined to let the story fade. The investigation team was officially disbanded. Files were archived, but not everyone let go. A few detectives, quietly, privately, continued to trace threads, follow shadows, check the details that had been ignored or suppressed. They worked in secret, driven by a stubborn need for answers, a refusal to let a life disappear into the ocean without cause. Yet the years passed. The Ocean Whisper continued its voyages along the same routes, its lights shimmering over calm waters, indifferent to the story that had unfolded on board. Other ships sailed, arriving and departing, carrying new passengers who would never know the shadows lurking in the decks below. Elena Carter's name became one among many in a list of those lost at sea, those who vanished into the vast, untraceable blue. No one knew where she truly went. No one knew what happened in that fateful night. And in the quiet hum of the waves, in the rhythm of the sea lapping against the hull, the absence remained, a presence unspoken, unacknowledged, lingering in the corners of memory and imagination. Somewhere out there, Elena Carter still drifted between fact and mystery, and the ocean, endless and indifferent, held its secrets close. The case was closed in the books, but the questions, the shadows, the unknown, they endured. Thank you for watching. I'll see you in the next videos, where we continue to follow the mysteries that have never slept. Don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned